Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Elisha Goldstein. Dr. Goldstien is a clinical psychologist, author, teacher, and founder of Emotional Longevity Experience, a global community created to help people reconnect to themselves, to each other, and to a way of living that is grounded, compassionate, and awake. For more than 2 decades, Dr. Goldstein has been helping people move through anxiety, depression, addiction, and disconnection, not with judgment, but with presence. His work is rooted in mindfulness, not as a buzzword, but as a daily practice of remembering who we are beneath the noise. He is the author of The Now Effect, Uncovering Happiness, the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook, and his upcoming book, Tiny Shifts, How Emotional Health Transforms Stress, Relationships, and Longevity. And his teachings have reached thousands of people around the world who are learning how to slow down, breathe, and meet their pain with curiosity instead of shame. What sets Elisha's voice apart is that it's not coming from above, it's coming from alongside. He has lived the questions he now helps others explore because he knows what it means to lose your center and to come back. Not all at once, but breath by breath. His story isn't about arriving at peace, it's about practicing it, returning to it, and building a life that honors it. Elisha reminds us that healing isn't about perfection, it's about presence. And that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is simply stay with ourselves long enough to hear what we've been trying to say. So, Dr. Goldstein, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you, Jalon. That was a really beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Also, I did give a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
Sure. Um, I am like a lot, and like many people who have my own kind of history of trauma and struggle and adventurous and pushing against the edges. And I grew up in a family where my parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. My mom felt like there was a need for her to be more independent and start a life that could allow her to do other things that she wasn't able to do in the marriage. And there was a little bit of a hook in there for me around, and I can see this image, and in my own therapy, Jelana, I've seen this image many times of her walking outside the door and kind of leaving the house, and that's always kind of been a button for me.
Mhm.
And it left this, I would say, it left this um, embedded thought or belief in me, maybe that I wasn't worth staying for, or loving, or and that started to show up in other places. And she went on to go back to school because she never finished college. She went to school, then never became a psychologist, which ultimately kind of inspired me to do the work that I do. Um, but nevertheless, it had its own scar, and we can talk about that maybe in the podcast if it's relevant. And then I went on, and I was always had my own interest in healing myself. For some reason, that just kind of lived in me. So I was kind of a self-help junkie. And but there was a part of me, and I was just talking about this with another client of mine, that would always push against the edges. I was the kid that would, find ways to take risks and get attention in other ways. I would go out to stores sometimes, and I would shoplift. Or I was later on in life, um, I would push against the edges with drugs and alcohol, and 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 not to paint that as the whole picture. I was also very creative and did these things too. Later on, I graduated from college. I went to San Francisco, I worked hard and played a whole lot harder. That's where the drugs and alcohol came in. I was successful in what I did, but something was missing. And at some point, I had an intervention in my life. My my dad and my stepmom, she wasn't quite my stepmom yet at the time, flew up and were like, you need time away from this, because I was gaunt. I was, partying like crazy. And I went away to an adult retreat center in Southern California. And that's where I uncovered, I was a little resistant to it, but just for everyone here, if this ever happens for anyone, what allowed me to do that was the permission to say, you can go there for a little bit. If you don't like it, you can opt out if you want to. So the control was mine. And this particular retreat center was an adult Jewish retreat center, because that's my cultural background. And I went there and I really challenged the spiritual element of it, and um, and came to understand a more mystical understanding of, through my own challenging of what God means to me, what as far as like a sense of a more of a universal sense of things. I came to understand the symbolism within my own spiritual tradition around, as an example here, the mezuzah that goes on the side of the door, which has a scroll within it for anyone here who has any kind of biblical understanding of things. With both Jalan and my name, both come from, have that background. The Shema, which is a Hebrew word which means listen, I started to really appreciate that symbol, because every time you walk into a door, if that's there, it reminds you to pause and listen. I was like, oh, that's all of a sudden meaningful to me. The you'll see like religious Jews wear these thing called tzitzit underneath their clothing, and it has these fringes on the bottom. The fringes are meant to remind you to do good deeds. I'm like, yeah, I could buy into that. And so I started to appreciate this, and it gave me a renewed sense of meaning. And I went back after those 30 days back into the corporate world. You wouldn't believe this, but I would wear my suit and tie with these fringes outside of my suit and tie, and everyone was like, what happened to this guy? What is he doing? Well, soon I took those fringes, I tucked them in. Soon I stopped wearing them anymore, and it only took me 2 weeks to fall back into my old habits. But that taught me a lesson. And the lesson of this is that um, how powerful community and our surroundings are. So I went back into my old community, and the cues and triggers around me just slowly eroded what I had built up over those past 30 days. But a seed was planted, and I knew something in me needed to change. And that's why I inevitably chose to look ahead and say, what do I want to look back on life and wish I would have done? And that's when I chose to go back to school to become a psychologist, because I was really interested in helping myself and helping other people, and understanding my own healing journey. I continued my healing journey through therapy and my own kind of creative ways. And inevitably, that's how I came to become today. There's more to the story, obviously, but I don't want to go on about how I got into mindfulness, the power of that in my own present life, historically and to now, where it translated into my interest in emotional health now, and the deep need people in today's current, in the current way things are going with the global wars that are out there, not only just the wars in our own home front, sometimes in our family and our communities, but also around the world, the uncertainty around the economy, where AI is going to take us into the future, and the uncertainty around that. And I just see a lot of people feeling very overwhelmed right now, and just with the juggling. And there's a deeper need than ever to strengthen our emotional health for what's happening now and for what's coming.
Thank you. That was like you had me captivated listening to you, and I want to dig so much deeper into that, because I think for someone such as yourself to be able to speak so openly and candidly about your experiences with struggle, we'll call it, um, can do so much for so many who may look at themselves and say, okay, well, I don't deserve this, or maybe that's just the way it is, or what have you. But I think if we can provide a path for relatability and cut out the fluff to where we're just all humans, and regardless of our status, regardless of our titles, regardless of anything, we're all doing this thing called life, and we all get bumps and bruises. Um, and hearing your story about your mom walking out the door and that being a trigger for you, I'm sure there's a lot of people that feel that same way. And you touched on a lot of what your younger life was like, and I want to go a little bit deeper. Were there any unspoken rules that you had in your family? Maybe things that, maybe not things necessarily that you couldn't say, but things that you felt that you maybe knew you couldn't associate with other people feeling, and that's why it may have been off limits.
It's interesting because I'm not even sure the unspoken rules came from my family. Like I know historically, and I'll say where they did come from though. They came from my experience, and because I know historically some families there's the idea that boys don't cry, girls
Mm,
don't get angry. There's these kind of unspoken rules that are there in our culture, in different cultures, in our some different cultures, um, and for me it was more of a feeling of kind of an implicit feeling of self worth
mm,
that kind of took a hit, and um, I think as much as there was actually some people who were trying to fan the flame of making sure I understood that if I, believe in myself, I can accomplish anything. Like there was these messages that were also given to me, but there was this kind of implicit sense that something's wrong with me. And even as I say that right now, everything continues to live within us. There's no magic moment where you've done a bunch of work and like emotions don't exist anymore. So even as I say that, I notice like a tinge of sadness that's there,
mm,
and because there is still that little boy that lives in me, and there's some grief for any of the pain or struggle that he went through, and um, so I think that that translated into maybe I wasn't worthy of love, and as much as that of course that was that not of course, but that wasn't the intention. My
mm,
dad, as an example, would try and overcompensate at times for that, and he gave a lot of love. My mom, was doing the best she could, and I'll just say this: there was one point in my relationship with her, and this is a good lesson for any parent right now listening, or teacher, or mentor, or anybody who feels like they've done something that maybe they've made a mistake and they feel like they might have hurt a child in some way, or maybe a friend, whatever. Uh, and she said to me, because this was later on, I was in my 20s and late teens, maybe early 20s. She said, and I was being kind of snippy with her, and she goes, Elisha, I think you're frustrated with me right now. And I think for me, um, anger, and I'll maybe talk about this, but anger at some point as a kid, I was a pretty angry kid, and I had reasons to be. I was a pretty angry kid, and I would be like willful. I would cross my arms when people asked me to do things. We'd go out to a restaurant. I would literally sit under the table at the restaurant. I can imagine like my dad was there. I can imagine what the server would come over and be like, "Is there someone under the table here?" I would sit on the table.
wow,
I'd refuse to eat because my reason was I didn't think we had the money to go out and eat. And I was pissed off that my dad would choose to take us out to a restaurant when I knew we didn't have the money. I was like carrying the stress of money, like at 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And, um, and meanwhile, what I was really angry about was the situation we were in. And it wasn't necessarily the money. That was kind of a cover up. I actually felt that that was true. Um, but, but I was just angry as a kid. And at some point I shut that down. I literally shut down my anger and and not in a healthy way. I'm not saying this is a healthy thing. I shut down my anger and decided, like, you know what? I'm just not going to feel this anymore. And so that made it difficult for me to be aware of and communicate my feelings. So when my mom said to me, "I think you're frustrated and irritated with me. I think something, and I know maybe you can't sense that or feel that right now. I don't know, but I want you to know, and this is the important piece. I want you to know that when you're ready, uh, I'm here to talk to you. I'm here to talk to you about that. Like you can come to me. I'm okay. It's okay." So something about that moment, about giving me permission
Mm.
to feel that feeling, I couldn't digest that completely in that moment. Our brains, our prefrontal cortexes aren't fully myelinated until like later in our 20s. So I wasn't able to fully register that entirely and communicate. But that allowed me to start a process of exploring, what's this feeling of anger that I have? What's it all about? Like, how do I experience it in my daily life? Like, it's important for us. The reason it's important for us to know how we're feeling is there's a couple reasons. One is that when we're not feeling well, and this translated into my life, when we're not feeling well, we're not feeling angry, or we're feeling sad, or we're feeling grief, or we're feeling anxiety, or we're feeling afraid. Um, that means that there's a need that's not being met. And if we're not aware of our feelings, we can't understand what that need is. And so then we can't move in the direction of getting that need met so we can feel more confident and balanced and stable in the world. And then also the second part about it is we can't communicate how we're feeling to somebody, and we can't communicate our needs. So that then leads to people pleasing, not setting boundaries, feeling resentful later on, then creates disconnection in the relationship. When relationships are disconnected, we don't feel well because we feel more stable and safe when we're connected. And so that gave me this permission to feel and begin to explore my feelings. And I think that started a journey, or that, I don't know, accelerated a journey, I would say, of being curious about my emotions, and the emotions I had at 6 years old, the emotions I had, or was totally unaware of in my early 20s, when I was abusing drugs and alcohol fairly consistently, and just kind of like numbing out, enjoying things but numbing out. And um, and that was a beautiful gift she gave me. And I write about it in Tiny Shifts. It's a through line in that upcoming book, because it's uh, it's probably one of those powerful things we can help give somebody for emotional awareness, is that permission to feel.
Was she already a psychologist at that point?
She was already a psychologist at that point. I remember in her graduate school, just a side part. I never forget, when she was in graduate school, she was like, I need to, give people certain tests as part of my homework. Can I give you an
Mm,
IQ test? Can I give you a this? She'd kind of work with me, but yeah, that was already. And she, by the way, just to say, like, not only did she go to graduate school, but she did a tremendous amount of her own personal work,
mm,
up and through that time. Uh, and that ultimately allowed us to have conversations about it, around what I felt when I was younger. It was only, I don't know, maybe even a year and a half ago. I mean, so this work isn't like, it's not necessarily one and done. The healing is a verb. And
mm,
so it was only like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago where we talked about it again, around
mm,
that time of wounding, that moment where she left, and the impact, and she was able to acknowledge the impact that had on us kids, 'cause I have two older sisters too. And um and uh, it was really, it's continually healing to be able to hear her express that. And
mm.
so that was a powerful part of my experience.
Yeah, I think, well, one thing I was gonna ask you is, do you ever feel like any resentment to the fact that she became a psychologist after the wounding?
I don't think resentment implies both anger and some kind of holding on to something like unprocessed in some
Mm,
way, and it creates a disconnection. Uh, I think because of all the work that I've done around this. Uh, what naturally more comes up for me is there's more grief and sadness
mm,
that maybe that when I reflect on that and reflect on my that inner child part of me, that part of me that was at that age and beyond, and then there's less anger. The anger has been transformed. I think underneath the anger was hurt and sadness,
of
is what it
course.
was. And so I've been able to kind of like go underneath that and get more in touch with that. And then more appreciation really for and maybe even being proud of her to some extent for for the courage it took
Yeah.
to branch out and go after her dreams.
Mm,
And she couldn't do that within our family as it was set up. And if she hadn't done that, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have become a psychologist. Maybe I would have. I don't know. But it's interesting. By the way, my dad is both uh, an author and a rabbi, and like a rock and rolling rabbi, not the black hat kind of rabbi, but kind of a more easygoing rock and rolling rabbi, and an author and a teacher and an educator, and my mom's a psychologist, and so I feel like I somehow kind of like blended the two. Not I'm not a rabbi at all, but the mindfulness element, the interest in that, and the kind of underlying spiritual aspect of that, kind of that's what reminds me of kind of a blended aspect of it.
nice. I was gonna ask you about that moment with your mom when she, I guess, maybe disarmed, that little guy inside of you and gave him permission to control the dynamic of his feelings. Do you think that that was a turning point for you that allowed you to now sit with that emotion and try and process it and maybe be mindful of what was happening internally?
I think it created an opening in me that was
Mhm,
unexpected, that I wasn't expecting. Uh, and in that moment, I remember because I can remember we remember moments that are emotionally salient to us, moments that everyday moments of life we don't necessarily remember all of them, and but the emotionally salient moments are the ones that remember. I remember that moment crystal clear.
mm,
And we were just standing in the kitchen. Like it was just an everyday type of thing, and she said that, and I remember just kind of almost like I was like just got a little stunned for a second. And like she pierced into something like deeper than the level we were living on, and like something within me. And yeah, that created a wedge, an opening to enter for me that I think did lead to me being curious and exploring these feelings, and has become a port and it's so significant that it's become a really important part of my personal narrative as far as my own growth,
mm.
especially in this field of emotions that's here.
Sure.
So yeah, powerful.
When would you say that mindfulness came into the picture?
So mindfulness came. So while I was in this kind of, you know, unstable stage of life in my 20s, I always tell people because I have people, and I work with teenagers sometimes, or I know a lot of teenagers, and um, I've interviewed people who are like puberty experts and teenage experts, adolescent experts, and we talk about how it's a challenging period of time, but I always say the 20s though. The 20s are a really challenging period for a lot of people. It's unexpected. This because they feel like they're out of their teens and they should be like, now free and in control of life. But the 20s are like, we're trying to kind of make sense of like, where do we fit in the world? And now we're supposed to be more responsible. And anyway, so I was living kind of a more unstable time, both being accomplished in some way, because it was the first time I ended up going into sales. I was actually I was going into pre-med because I was interested in the brain and psychiatry, and then I worked in an inpatient adolescent hospital in Walnut Creek, California, for 10 months, and realized, well, I'm not quite sure I want to make that investment in medical school. And so I ended up, both my sisters were sales recruiters, and they ended up recruiting me into an outside sales position in telecommunications, reselling long distance lines. That's what it was back then. And so I would go around to companies in San Francisco, and I would try and help them change their provider or whatever. And I was really good at it. It was the first time in my life that I felt like I was really good at something. And at the same time, I was living this kind of alternative life where I was that way in the day and this way in the night. And I'm trying to remember what your original question was with that.
Where mindfulness came into play.
Okay, so yes. So then during that time, while that was all happening, I was reading a lot of, I knew there was a self-healing needed to happen. I was in therapy, and I was exploring my own kind of creative work too. And I was reading a lot of like Eastern and Western books on kind of philosophy. And so I was kind of teasing out some mindfulness there, but it wasn't until I went to graduate school and decided to go back to a school that, and this is just a little side note of the story, is I knew I wanted to help myself and help other people more in this world. That was going to be more purposeful to me. But I didn't really like the graduate school. I didn't really like the options out there. I didn't want to go to some mainstream. It didn't fit. I wanted like a melding of the way I understood things, which was more of people have a spiritual background. And no graduate school at the time in the field of psychology would honor that, except for a couple that was just deeply Christian based. But more variety of spiritual traditions. That was like it's a complete separation. Psychology and spirituality completely separate. There was one school down in the South Bay in Northern California at the time called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Now, that school was an accredited school, and they recognized spirituality as part of people's lives and part of people's psychology. But I didn't want to go there because my mom told me that if I go there, I'll never get a job, because that's like an alternative school to some degree. You need to go to like a mainstream thing. Anyways, I chose not to take her advice, and I inevitably went back there. And as part of your dissertation, you have to do a study to become in your doctoral work. And as part of my dissertation, I recognized in a class I was taking that what I wanted to help people do was recognize the more of the sacred in their everyday life. And because if I was living and more aware of the sacred in everyday life, sacred means what was purposeful and meaningful in life, something maybe even greater than ourselves, then that would be a really great one, wonderful life. And so I wanted to help people do that. And so when I was studying that, I realized in order for people to be more aware of what's purposeful and meaningful or what's sacred in their life, it had to be present. So then I had to look out there. I said, okay, well, if I'm running a dissertation, I have to look at what's the most researched thing out there around learning how to be present. And that's when I came upon Jon Kabat-Zinn's Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. So this was a program that was created in 1979 from a guy who was he was working in a hospital, and he told all the chronic pain doctors, like, give me all your patients that your chronic pain meds aren't working for. And he put them through an 8-week program around mindfulness. It's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that was training people how to be aware of their pain and relate to it differently. And so that they weren't hating it and ruminating and complaining around it, which only inflames the body. And in a way which brought more presence to it, what he found was in doing that and bringing more present moment awareness and how people were relating to the pain and training them how to do that, it reduced their perception of the pain. So their actual experience of the pain went down. There's been many studies since then that have gone through that. This 8-week program blew up. 1991, he was in Bill Moyers. 2000 is when the whole neuroscience revolution started happening in the psychological field. Richie Davidson, this guy out of the University of Wisconsin, was what put neuroscience to it and started showing that when you do these practices about learning how to be more present to your body or to your emotions or to your breath, you activate certain parts of the brain that support emotion regulation and pain perception. And so we started seeing this, the neurology of this whole thing kind of unfolding. And so for me, I inevitably got trained. I took and then got trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction. I became a teacher in mindfulness-based stress reduction. It was a wonderful 8-week program. At the time, had so much science and research behind it. I started my own practice, started happening even more regularly at the time. I think prior to that, people confuse mindfulness with meditation. There's mindfulness, which just means being present to the moment, just awareness, with a sense of curiosity. Then there's mindfulness meditation, which means taking time out, like prayer, or like it's not prayer, but it's like we would take time out for prayer. We would take time out for meditation. There's a variety of types of meditation. Prayer is a type of meditation. Transcendental meditation. There's concentration meditation. Mindfulness meditation is just about being present and aware of what's here. And there's a variety of practices to do that. So I was trained in that. I started my practice in that. I inevitably integrated that into my doctoral dissertation, which was titled Sacred Moments, Implications on Well-Being and Stress, which I trained people on how to create more presence and relate to what's meaningful and purposeful in their life for short segments of the day. And that study showed statistically significant results in stress reduction and increases in deeper areas of psychological well-being, which is involved with feeling a sense of more connected and meaningful and purposeful in life, and more positive emotion, let's say more comfortable emotions versus uncomfortable emotions, and greater life satisfaction. And that was with a short practice in the day, and that was later published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. And so that's where my mindfulness journey began.
Thanks for sharing that. That study where I forget the doctor's name, but he took all of the patients who their medication hadn't been working for them and put them through that 8-week program and helped them. Like, that had to be a game changer. And I also wonder if the doctors who weren't able to help those patients maybe got their feelings hurt that something something else was helping, because if you're in a position to where you help people and maybe that's the standard, and then someone introduces something new, it could feel like a personal attack on what you do. And people can look at it one of two ways. They can look at it and say, okay, well, I should try and integrate this into what I'm doing, or they could say, well, I don't believe in that, it was a fluke or what have you. So there's a lot that can be um, dug up with that. And I guess for people who may not be so familiar with mindfulness, I think a lot of us will get to a point to where we don't necessarily find mindfulness through peace, but normally from hitting like a rock bottom or a point where something had to change. And so I wanted to ask, how can that look in real time, and what usually follows?
I don't know if that in the rock bottom moment. So my rock bottom moment was always been very clear to me. It was a moment where I was in San Francisco. Well, I'll never forget this either. And had been up for 3 days on
Mm.
like a binge, and I it was like 5 a.m, and it was Monday, and I had to go to work, and um, I went to this club that was open at the time. It was called the End Up, because it's where everyone ended up after
Mm.
everything else was closed. And I remember going to that place in the past, and there was this guy there that uh, was always kind of like totally tweaked out. And I told my friends, like, if you ever catch me with this guy, you know, I've hit rock bottom. That's it. And so there I was with that guy in like this broken down limousine, south of San Francisco, south of Market in San Francisco, and and I was wanting something to help me stay awake so that I could go to work. I'd been up for 3 days. I thought that I could go to work, like, after being up for 3 days, if someone gave me something to stay awake. I was obviously like just completely lost my mind. And so, but there I was, and it was pretty much, there was like like a some kind of like also like a woman in the limousine that had been like clearly physically abused in some way as well. But I just wasn't really paying attention to that because I was not in my right mind. And so there he was, and he gave me the opposite of what I needed. He gave me this ketamine. And ketamine, for those of you now, ketamine is like an antidepressant. People can get now; it's like an FDA approved type of thing. But back then, it was a tranquilizer, and it completely like um, knocked me down. And as a result of that, I said, no, really what I was looking for was some crystal meth. That's what I wanted. I wanted that to keep me awake. And he's like, I could go get that. And I stayed and sat at this donut shop with this woman waiting for him to come back with this stuff. And it was taking so long that I marched into this hotel. And this lady, as soon as I get in there, says, man, you shouldn't be in here. This is not a good place for you to be. And finally, I'm like, I just woke up in that moment. I'm like, what am I doing? And I decided to just walk back home, because in San Francisco you could do that. It's not that big of a place. And I went back, and that moment really changed everything for me. That moment was a moment I decided to um, get back into getting more help. And the other moment for me, I think, if I look back on it, was the moment that my dad flew up and had that intervention. My stepmom was there, and they kind of like told me to go to this adult retreat place, which I'd mentioned earlier. But this moment kind of sticks with me because it's so emotionally salient. Um, and Mindfulness didn't come into play in that moment, but it opened, just like my mom saying, there's a certain moments that like to create a wedge, that create an opening. Just like her giving me permission to feel the anger. Um, this gave me, in some way, an opening to really investigate just how sideways my life had gone. And there I think it opened me up to the power of investigating my emotions, investigating more mindfulness, because I saw it as a way of like, I just want to live better. I want to be here for my life, not like just numbing out or somewhere else. Three days. I mean, you just wreck your body and mind. Like it's not sustainable. And I did that many times.
Mm.
And but it opened me up. And what mindfulness helped me do as I began to practice it more in my life was it helped me interrupt the moments I um, was not here. I was up in my head.
Mm.
I was worrying, thinking, being self-critical, self-doubting, and it allowed me to come into it, trained me to unhook from that and come into my body. And just the reason that's important, just from a neuroscience perspective, for anyone who's interested in that, is later on there was a study that showed that when we are present to our body, like our body, or really like anything, there's two gears in our brain, basically. We can kind of think of it like that. There's a gear that lights up when our mind is wandering and it's kind of problem solving and it's being creative. It's a really wonderful area called the default mode network. And that's a wonderful network, except when we're off and stressed. And then it becomes into worrying, self-critical voices, self-doubt. Like it starts kind of going in that direction. There's another part of the mind, the brain, that is more associated with what I call it the present focus network. And that's like when we're like engaged in something, like we're aware of like how we're feeling emotionally. We're maybe like really engaged in a task too. It could be that. That's why there's some people who like they come home and they're kind of a mess in their mind, but they're like, when I'm at work, I'm not thinking about any of that. It's like, okay, when I'm on the field, when I'm playing sports, I'm not thinking about any of that. Okay, with that, when I'm involved in my art, I'm not thinking about any of that. That's because they're really in that flow. They're really present in that moment, and so that part of their brain kind of comes down. So it's like justice scales. When one is up, the other is down. By the way, this understanding of thing completely solved a past history of insomnia that I used to have as well, because understanding the neuroscience of that helped me trust that when my brain wouldn't shut off, both that and my mindfulness practice, when and I'll explain that just for a second. When my brain wouldn't shut off at night and it was worrying, I used to like worry. I couldn't fall asleep. I knew the next day was going to be awful, and then that would just kind of keep me up longer. And then at college, I remember having a roommate that was like a huge snorer, and it was all compounding on itself. But later on, in understanding the neuroscience of this, I was able to see that and trust that if I could just bring myself back to this body, even though my mind was telling me that it was going to be so terrible and this isn't going to work, and just do something different, toss and turn, whatever. If I could just come back and bring myself back to my toes and my feet, and then my mind would go off again and kind of bring myself back, that eventually that part of my brain, that self-referencing network, that default mode, would start to, it's like justice scales. If I could strengthen my ability to be present, then this would start to cool down. And that's exactly what began to happen. And the more success I had with that, the more confidence I had around it. And I completely healed my history with insomnia by that.
Um, so what if some people are saying, okay, like I get it, I understand mindfulness, but you're a doctor, right? And I've been doing the work and I'm not getting better. Um, what would you say to someone who's been reading the books, going to therapy and trying to heal, but they still feel like they're stuck?
There's a 15th century Indian poet named Kabir that said, wherever you are, that's the entry point. So
Mm.
typically, if you are doing the work and you still feel stuck, what's happening is your mind is likely going off into some what I call the emotional loop. So it's still not there's still something that's a disconnect between the ability to name what's happening. There's a guy I was working with recently who um, he's feeling really stuck, and he's an entrepreneur, and the last couple of years have been kind of hard, and um, he's always up in his head worrying about things. And it's really hard for him to be present. And we talked about how this idea of wherever you sometimes just naming, like I'm having a hard time being present with my kids. I know we talked about the power of connection. Connection is a foundation that the science shows, the research shows this, is a foundation for coming back to feeling well. When we feel disconnected, we don't feel well. When we feel more connected, it tells our nervous system that we're safe. Well, he has a family that he feels like is a loving family, and but he's having a hard time being present to that. And so he feels very disconnected, friends, family, everything, even though that's right there. Just like we can feel very lonely right in the middle of a ton of people, right? Or even people we care that care about us. We can feel very lonely. It's all about the way our mind is stuck in not being able to tap into that. So I would say this, that if you're still feeling stuck and you've done all of this work, that there is um, the there is a path towards learning how to come back to what's here. Typically, that means we're still avoiding something uncomfortable that's here. We don't want to be here, or we want something to be different than it is. And we just don't want to feel what's the discomfort that's here. So we say, if we come back to that quote, wherever you are, that's the entry point. Sometimes just naming, like, wow, this is really hard. And you might have heard that before. Be very careful. I have to tell myself this all the time. Be very careful to not step in the expert's mind. That's hard for a professional too, or someone that feels like they've done so much work. Be very careful with that. Like when someone suggests something and you say, like, I've tried that. I've tried everything. I'm always really wary about someone that says, I've tried everything. Because then they're stuck in the expert's mind, which means they don't allow themselves, they can't see what might be here that might be useful. So we say to ourselves that this is really hard. If you say this is really hard, or I'm noticing like I'm really there's a lot of struggle here right now, or I'm noticing a lot of frustration around the lack of progress. I'm noticing as soon as you say that and just allow that to be what you do, you've entered being here. And that ability to be here and be present opens up a lot of doors. I'm sure, Jalon, people on your podcast, or maybe they've heard this quote by Viktor Frankl that says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response, and our response lies our growth and our freedom. So being able to say, like, hey, this is hard. I've done all this work, and what's wrong with me? So this is what happens. I've done all this work, and it goes to like, what's wrong with me, or things are never going to get better. That's what I call the emotional loop. And you can, the naming it is what is really the first step. And this is kind of what I start unpacking in my therapeutic coaching program, but also in the beginning of this next book, Tiny Shifts. This emotion, I wrote about the emotional loop and uncovering happiness as well. But this is this emotional loop, and we can have fun with it. This is the I'm never going to get better loop. There it is. Or nothing's ever going to help me loop. There it is. Or the expert mind loop, call it that. Frustration loop. There's whatever word, we just want to name it. Because if we can name it, we can tame it, as a friend and colleague of mine, Dan Siegel, says. So we enter now that present moment. Kabir says, wherever you are, that's the entry point. So we name it, that allows us to enter. That allows us to step into that space between stimulus and response. But that's not enough, because that's only like a short window. That emotional brain, which is a deeper and faster and stronger, especially has a history of like trauma or abuse or anything like that, or that's been, maybe you've worked with it, but you haven't felt like a certain level of healing that you've arrived at yet. And so we name it, and that opens that space for a moment. But we need a wider space to be able to kind of hook in. So this is where people miss and don't do. This is the step that gets skipped all the time. So this is part of something I call the 4R method. So we recognize, that's the important piece. That's in so many different methods. Recognize, label. That's like thousands of years of history of wisdom tradition who have taught that. Neuroscience shows that when we label something, we get more activation in our prefrontal region, which is more involved with impulse control and emotion regulation. Creates a line back to the limbic system, which says like, okay, I see that you're embroiled. What do we do about this? But the next step is very important. So the next step is something I call release. We have to understand that when we feel stuck, we say, I feel stuck. This is all one thing here. So if you feel stuck, or you feel angry, or you feel frustrated, or you feel these different emotions that might be here, and the better you are at naming emotions, the more you'll be precise in meeting your needs and be able to communicate that with other people. There's a physiological correlate going on, because it's impacting the sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to fight, flight, or freeze in that moment. That's what we're being compelled to do, which means we're tensing. Typically, our body is bracing somewhere. Our heart rate's going up. Our muscles are starting to contract. All this stuff is happening. What we need is not to intervene at the thought level. That's the wrong place to intervene. When someone's if you're feeling anxious or panicky, you wouldn't go to a friend who's anxious or panicky and ask for their advice. So we don't want to go to our mind to ask for our advice either. What we need to do is widen that space between stimulus and response so we have more access to the choice, possibility, and freedom. The way we do that is somatically. And there's something very simple. I'll give you the simplest way to do this right now. If someone took a couple deep breaths, and you can even try this, and this is not about the breath, by the way. So I know a lot of people say, take deep breaths. That's not what we're doing here. But when you take a deep breath, notice what's happening to my body. If you're watching this, you can see this. If you're listening to this, my shoulders are rising. As I breathe out, my shoulders come down. What happens when your shoulders come down? Your neck muscles and your shoulders muscles have to elongate. And we want to feel that loosening, that stretch. And sometimes we actually need to kind of stretch it out. And when we stretch it out, it sends signals to our brain that of safety, of more presence. And that's what we're looking for. So now in that space, now that our body's a bit more balanced, our mind's going to be a bit more balanced as a result of that as well. Again, it's all connected. We're sending the signal that way. Then what we can do is we can drop in a new question. See, we have the wherewithal now to do this, because when we ask ourselves a question, our brain searches for answers. It's the same as AI. AI just models our brain. So I call this natural intelligence. So just like Google or AI, we ask a question now that we have the wherewithal, and our brain's going to look for an answer. And the answer, so the basic question is, and we get this out of the mindfulness tradition or around the emotional health tradition, is what do I really need right now? What am I really needing right now? Or you can ask yourself, what's going to be most supportive for me right now? So if your brain's telling you all kind of self-critical stuff or telling you all the things that are going to go wrong, now you're creating you're redirecting it, because wherever our focus goes, we create a certain energy. And so we've heard that kind of quote before. And so we're refocusing in that moment. So that's the third R. So we recognize, we release, we refocus. And then the last thing is, and this is the thing that a lot of people miss as well, is we have to, just like we were talking about, Jalan, our brain remembers things that are emotionally salient. We need to make this emotionally salient so it becomes more memorable. And that's how things become more automatic. So we take a moment to do something that I call reinforce. And so the moment we notice an emotional shift or a new insight or something changes, it could just be like 5%, not a big deal. We notice we feel that in the body, and we just kind of place our hand there, wherever we're kind of feeling that, or it could be really anywhere. You can place your hand to just let your brain know, and you can say this in your mind, like, this matters. You're just trying to record it. You're trying to get it to be, by doing that, you're bringing it into your short-term working memory so that it's more retrievable in the moments that follow. This matters, I matter, whatever, depending on whatever the experience is. By doing that, by the way, you send the message implicitly that I matter. But so that's the way. If someone's feeling stuck, there is a path. The path is wherever you are, that's the entry point. So you just kind of name the stuckness and you work with it in that way with what's there. Yeah.
Wow. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing that. There's a saying that I've heard that kind of reminds me of that. It's what's in the way is the way.
That's perfectly said. Yeah, beautiful. Do you know who said? Is that where you know where that came from?
No,
I love that.
I interviewed Bob Falconer. He's a IFS therapist, and he mentioned it. He said he gave the example of, he said, you would hate to see ants in your kitchen on the counter, but also if you see the ants, it's because there's something there that you need to clean up.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that, and I said, wow, that it's all about shifting how you look at it. It really is. So go ahead.
It's funny that he uses ants because, in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is like a big pillar of certain therapy, they say ants are automatic negative thoughts. So that's what the acronym stands for. So if you notice those, ants are marching all over you. Yeah, that's because there's something that needs to be cleaned up.
Something there. Yeah, exactly.
Love that. That's a good one.
If you could be known for one thing that would define your legacy, what would you want that to be?
Really like making a big impact in helping people uh, relate to their thoughts, feelings, and needs, be aware of and relate to them in a way that helps them feel like no matter what comes my way, I can handle it. I'm going to be okay.
Mm,
And um, and I really do. And it's interesting, Jalan, because I've said this to people over the past couple of years, maybe a few years, and I feel like every year it becomes more and more true. Which is like we are living in a time right now where we need to strengthen our emotional health more than ever. And we need to strengthen that feeling more than ever because not just of what is here right now, all this the social media, the media that we hear, the that people feel like our things are upside down in a lot of ways. I mean, I just think about honestly, like I think I'm sitting there in my family in my house, and between going to the different chat groups that I have or the messages that I'm responding to, and then the Amazon returns and and not to mention the disconnection I might be feeling in certain relationships that I have, or worrying about where this country is going, or the uncertainty when I see job loss happening as a result of AI, or maybe it's going to be better. I don't know, but the uncertainty around it, we need to be able to learn how to come back to center and be aware of what matters so we can feel connected with ourselves and connected with the meaningful relationships in our lives, and feel like we're like that feeling that I can handle this, whatever is going to come, I can handle this, I'm going to be okay.
mm,
And I'm sitting there on a horse coming in, and just kind of waving the flag, and saying like this is I'm trying to impact as myself and as many lives as I possibly can to help support that sanity in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
mm.
Yeah,
Well, you're doing
that's
a
what I'd
good
like to
job of that.
be known for. Like this guy really, um, this guy really helped me, and I'll say even though I said all these lives, one life is really meaningful.
Mm,
When I hear from one life, the impact, um, that could be enough.
yeah.
And yet there is this mission of like many lives, and the ripple effects that can come from that. And I realize that I'm only one person, and you're only one person. Whoever's listening to this is only one person, but it is very true that together, when there's many people kind of doing this type of thing, we create these incredible ripples that could really make a difference.
Mm. Beautifully said. You can go back to that moment with 6-year-old Elisha where he saw his mom walk out. What would you say to him now?
I mean, the first thing I'd say, well, I have a few things come to mind, which is I got you.
Mm,
Um, she loves you.
mm.
It's going to be okay.
Hope he heard it.
Yeah. And as I was expressing that, just to do a little embodied dialogue, I felt these shivers come all over my body. Yeah.
Let me transition that into someone who maybe has seen someone they love walk out and they're just at the entry point of their healing work and they need to hear something that will encourage them to keep moving forward. If you had a line straight to their heart right now, what would you say to them?
At that age, as say to a 6-year-old, or it could be,
Their inner 6-year-old right now.
uh huh. Yeah. I would say you may not feel like you're loved right now, or you may feel like you're are not worthy of being cared for. But give this a little space and time, and you will recognize that taking in the love that is there for you, and learning how to love yourself, and it's going to be okay.
Mm. Thanks for that message. All right, last question for you. With all the work that you're doing to help people and all the work that you've done to help yourself, what is it that you want people to know most, if you could sum it all up?
Oftentimes when we're feeling stuck, and we feel like there's we can't see our way out, or we're feeling like we're in this pattern, or low hum of missing out on our lives because we're feeling so overwhelmed. Um, it doesn't take massive lifts or breakthroughs to begin making shifts in our lives. It's really all about how we relate to the everyday moments that are here. And if we can learn how to make these kind of tiny shifts, we can we can enhance how we feel, the stress we're holding. We can enhance the connection of our relationships that matter to us, or relationships just in our lives in general, and ultimately we can positively impact our health, how we feel physically, which translates into um, how well we function into the years ahead in our lives, both emotionally, mentally, and physically.
Well said. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have had to do this with you, Elisha. This has been an incredible conversation. Your depth of knowledge is unparalleled. I mean, we could probably talk for hours on hours, and I think you would still be able to, drop new nuggets of wisdom and just show us really who you are. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to be able to allow for my audience to have a window into um, Dr. Goldstein, because we need more people like you. And the work that you're doing, the work that you've done, it's truly a gift to the world. And I'm honored to be able to have this time that we've shared together.
Thank you, Jalan. And I've also just want to acknowledge you and the channel you opened to reach into people's lives and make it and make your own impact, be one of the ripples out there too. And I've really appreciated your presence and your intentionality, and yeah, I've, I'm really been really happy to be here with you.
If people want to find you online, oh, thank you. Thank you. I don't want to ignore that. I felt that deeply. If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
You can go to elishagoldstein.com, ELISHAGOLDSTEIN.com. Social media is at the handle Dr. Elisha Goldstein, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Um, and I also run the Emotional Longevity podcast, which is all about emotional health and how do we shore that up? Like some ways we talked about here, and interviewing people as well, and we have that for the long run. And you can find more news about my upcoming book, Tiny Shifts, on my website. And also, yeah, we'll just kind of leave it there. That's good.
All right. I'll put all of that in the show notes so people can
Cool.
find you too. So, all right. Well, again, Dr. Goldstein, this has been incredible. I just want to thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Thank you, Jelon.